Hey, Andrew Austin of TheFARPodcast. I'm coming to you from my dining room, and I'm using a Fi-Fi microphone. There's some new gear because I have my podcasting, vidcasting studio, and set up upstairs to do that as well. But I just wanted to get away from, all those lights and technology, and be able to do some things that are a bit dressed down. So I was here working in this space, which I like a lot. Upstairs, lots of light, nice and open. So you'll probably get some reverberation in the microphone. Okay, so Whoopi Goldberg stepped in it recently. She was responding to a controversy. There was a book about the Holocaust. It told the story using animals. And there's a tradition of doing this. George Orwell did this in Animal Farm. So you talk about totalitarianism or some terrible system or event, and you use animals. And McMinn County, it's a county fairly close to where I grew up. Some members of the school board and some parents were troubled by nudity. Now you could say, well, that's a little silly. I mean, they were animals. Animals are nude, whatever. But the way that it was depicted, they're anthropomorphized, right? Humanized animals, and this troubled people who saw it, parents and the school board members. And there was obscenity. So they said, well, let's redact the obscenity and so forth. And they met with the lawyer, and the lawyer's like, you're probably going to run afoul of some copyright issues. So they figured, not every library has this book in it, so we'll just remove the book. And I'm not defending, what they did. I'm just trying to help you sort of understand their reasoning, and so they've been accused of censorship. Now, before I get to Whoopi Goldberg, I just want to point out that I am a staunch defender of the First Amendment. I think that censoring, banning books is a terrible idea. When they come after To Kill a Mockingbird, when they come after a whole number of books, I speak up. And I haven't spoken up as loudly about this book being taken off the shelf because it was one school board. I kind of can see what their thinking was. I don't agree with it. But I don't think it's this massive scandal. I think the author of the book is super rich and reacted in a certain way. And of course, progressive Democrats use this to push this narrative of white supremacy, white nationalism and so forth. It's one county in Tennessee. Whereas the assault on To Kill a Mockingbird and other books that contain objectionable words we're not allowed to say. We're reduced to third graders. We have to say N-word and things like that because you can't say the sacred word. Progressive Democrats have no problem going after these books. They also have no problem going after teachers and curricula that they feel doesn't either represent what they want to be represented or is critical of their views, critical of gender ideology, critical of all sorts of things. The progressive left, progressive Democrats, whatever you want to call them, they embody the cancel culture. There's some canceling that goes on from the right. There's some censorship that goes on the right. So we're talking about that. But the left, so-called left, they're not really left if they believe in censorship and banning books and canceling people and so forth, because that's a very illiberal position. It's a very authoritarian position. I consider myself to be a man on the left. Of the left, and I strongly defend free speech. So I think in college classrooms, for example, and after I talk about Whoopi, I want to get back to this because I have something I want to say about this. I think in college classrooms, and I think legislators who are trying to ban discussion of critical race theory in classrooms in college, it's not a good thing. We should be able to talk about these theories. I think you run into big problems. I don't think you do run into huge problems when you use critical race theory to undergird diversity, inclusion, equity, training, these sorts of things. And I do think you run into big trouble when you use a theory like that to frame social studies education K through 12. But I'll get to that. Let me get back to Whoopi, because it's all tied together. And it'll sound as I'm going through this as if I'm accusing the progressive left of hypocrisy, but hypocrisy means that the person's speech and action are incongruent with their principle, and the progressive left isn't operating on principle here. They're just straight up authoritarian. Progressive left, progressive Democrats are the most authoritarian force in society today. And they're a real threat to free speech, to freedom of association, assembly, to our rights to privacy. And a big part of free speech, of course, is the right to not be compelled to speak. That loyalty oaths are, as a general rule, are a bad idea. So let's get back to this book that was banned and Whoopi Goldberg's reaction to that. And it was about the Holocaust, and it's being spun as this, the white supremacists took this off the shelf. So this is one more, just like those truckers in Ottawa. If you're Black Lives Matter, you can vandalize, you can tear down statues, you can commit arson, whatever. It's mostly peaceful protests, and this is the language of the unheard, and these are people who are rebelling against systemic racism. But you have truckers who are rebelling against an actual government mandate, quarantining people who cross state boundaries for a virus, which of course has been vastly exaggerated, and it has. And what the truckers can see is this is really not about the virus, it's about control. And so they're rebelling against control. But because it's a form of control that the progressive left likes, then all of a sudden these truckers are awful. They're racist and white nationalists. You can find one person with a Nazi flag in a crowd of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, and the whole group is racist. Oh, look, there's a Confederate flag. They're all white nationalists. And yeah, all right, the person's got the Confederate flag. Who knows who he is? It's completely covered. And I don't rule out Asian provocateurs. Don't rule that out. We know we have evidence throughout history of planting people with flags, with insignia, in order to make the whole group look bad. And after all, I think that I remember hearing a lot of people on the left saying that the people who were causing trouble at the Black Lives Matter, Antifa. Of course, Antifa was causing trouble, but even the Antifa, there were right-wingers in there that were instigating it and causing trouble. Whoopi Goldberg says that the Holocaust wasn't really about race. And she says that it was about man's inhumanity to man. That's given. But it was about race. And I think we need to talk about in what way it was about race. Because the question has come up that the Jews were a race. Hitler was trying to exterminate them because he saw them as an inferior race. And Whoopi's saying, no, Jews are white. They're not a race. And so it wasn't about race. Okay, so Whoopi's wrong not because Jews aren't white, but because Hitler saw Jews as an inferior race. There were the Aryans, and there's different tiers of Aryan. There are non-Aryans who are acceptable races, and then there are the unacceptable races. And the Holocaust was obsessed with this, and yes, Jews were the primary target. Hitler and many of those around him had a particular loathing for Jews. Whoopi thinks of race as black and white. She elaborated on her thinking, and I understand where she's coming from. You look at a black person, you can see they're black. Maybe it depends, but and generally speaking, we have pretty good cultural training in that. But you wouldn't maybe know a Jew unless you heard the name or knew their background or whatever. And so she said it needed work. And the Nazi scientists had that work. They had a whole scientific scheme. They had tables, hierarchy tables of races and so forth. And that's the issue. For Nazis, they racialized everything. So so there was no distinction between ethnicity and race in their minds. There is, in sociology, we make a distinction between race and ethnicity. Ethnicity is about culture, about dress, it's about art and music and language. And race is a biological notion. Now, I will argue that, I mean, it's a complex case. The human population doesn't divide very neatly up into the racial categories that we're familiar with. You know, and going back to the old racial science from the 19th century, you know, you had the Mongoloids, the Asians, and between, you know, the Mongoloid and Asians, the term Oriental was applied. You had the Negroids, people from Africa, but not everybody from Africa, because there's the Caucasoids, which are the white folks, and in North Africa you had, and in the Middle East and so forth, you had Caucasoids or Caucasoidal people. That's the old language. So, but that's about, and Whoopi said that, you know, I can look at somebody and I can say, right, that's called the phenotypic characteristics, right? We're all one genotype racially. We're all the same species, but phenotypically because of ancestry, and that's really what race is, it's ancestry. And that's why at the margins, not even at the margins, it begins to break down pretty quickly. So we make a distinction between race, which even if it doesn't exist, we recognize that there's this scheme that exists that group people according to these phenotypic characteristics, constellations. Some people have physical anthropologists have supposed that maybe we should, you know, drop the concept of race and start using a concept called clines, and so forth. And there's some recent population genetics, which is pretty fascinating to get into all of that. And certainly for, you know, in forensics, physical anthropologists can, within a certain degree of certitude, tell you what race a victim was and so forth. That's a physical. So clearly you can judge that from a skeleton. Although they'll be wrong a lot, much better at sex, determining sex from skeletons than they are race. Okay, but you get the picture. Ethnicity is this learned thing. One is born black, but one is only Polish because they're born in Poland and they learn the language and the culture and whatever. If they were born in Germany to German parents and learn the language and whatever, there'd be no racial distinction. But with Hitler, by conflating race and ethnicity, he racialized everything. So it's an extreme form of identitarianism. Race, ethnicities, you know, combined, and you're going to hierarchically organize that society. And so you're going to have first-class citizens and second-class, third-class men, and then you're going to have the unacceptable races, and you're going to either, you know, you're going to eliminate them in some way. You're either going to force them to leave, and that was, Nazis had an idea about that, or you're going to exterminate them. They had that idea, and that was, as they moved down the path, extermination became the project, and it was quite horrific. It wasn't just race and ethnicity. Jehovah's Witnesses were targeted, homosexuals were targeted, communists were targeted, socialists were targeted, labor was targeted, right? So there was they don't fit within racial ethnic groups. But they were, you know, political enemies, and that's what we refer to as democide, getting rid of people for their political views. So genocide also came along with democide. And then you had the, you know, extreme heterosexism and the persecution, elimination of homosexuals and so forth. So it was, you know, so the degree in which you want to separate out the Holocaust as being specific to the Judeo-side from the other ones, and so, right, that I'm talking about the scholarship. This is a vast scholarship on this. So Whoopi thinks she knows a lot. She doesn't know a lot. And if she knew the literature, she could have talked about this in a better way. And so she came, and then she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend anybody." Then I think she went on Colbert. I was reading about this just a few minutes ago. And yeah, it was the Colbert Show. And she came on the Colbert Show, and she tried to explain it again. And she wanted people to understand why, you know, she made the point. And then everybody gets upset again. And then she comes out on the show today and she says, "Okay, I was wrong. Well, I misspoke. I wish people would stop saying I misspoke, because I don't think she thinks she's wrong. I think she still believes this. And if she no longer believes it because people educated her, she could say, I was wrong. I misspoke. Such weasel words. In fact, it's been, more than 24 hours, well, up until, I guess, 24 hours between when she was on The View and then when she comes back around The View, of just weasel words. Okay. But it's very dangerous to racialize populations in this way. I've written about this on my blog. I say racializing Jews. People are like, well, so what do you, white people aren't racialized? Yeah, they are. That's the point. Whiteness, having white skin, when white people appeared, that is an anthropological fact. We know when it occurred, and we know which populations. And in fact, people from the Middle East, from Central Asia, were the first white people. And then they spread out from there. And it's about 8 to 10,000 years ago, white people appeared. That's just a fact. Jesus was white according to the racial standards of the last several centuries. You say, well, but nobody saw race then. Well, that's not really true either. But the point is that it's dangerous to do this. So if you say, so Jews are white, recognized as white, and you say, yeah, but not really white. If you do a really depth racial analysis, well, now you sound like a Nazi. That's what Nazis said. The Nazis racialized the Jews. And it's disturbing to me that you would see people pick that up and say, well, that's right, the Jews aren't white. Well, what? Well, and moreover, the only reason I'm saying this is because I would like to see us get rid of race altogether. Right? I'm an advocate of color blindness. Not I don't see race, but everybody's treated as individuals. And when you start doing that, after several generations, or really sooner than that, you because we had this experiment and we ruined it with what? Identitarianism. And we're back on that road again. I hope you see that. And it's not coming from the Nazis. It's coming from progressive left. And they're subdividing and dividing. They're creating this hierarchy, and they want to flip it. But I want it to go away. I want it to go away. And the only reason I would even point out that Jews are white is because this is the racial system that was constructed, that emerged over several centuries. Let's don't go down the Hitlerian path and re-racialize everybody in this direction, which is the direction we're going, where ethnicity is being treated as race, where religion is being treated as race. Think about that. I mean, they now in Europe, when they talk about Islam and Islamophobia and all of that, they call it racism. Well, that's the Nazis would agree. But religion has nothing to do with race. Culture has nothing to do with race. Language has nothing to do with race. These things don't come from racial types. That's a racialist theory. And so what was Hitler really doing then? The same thing that progressives do today. He was practicing what we call essentialism. He was taking cultural differences, physical differences, fine-tuning the system by which you could detect subtle differences between human populations, their languages, their cultures, their religions, et cetera, sensibilities, and their ancestry, their lineage. He was racializing all that and making a determination as to who gets what based on those categories, which is not about equality. Equality would be treating individuals regardless of all of that. Well, certainly regardless of the basis of sex, except where there are sexual differences that fairness would require differential treatment. On the question of race, these differences don't exist. Therefore, treating any race differently is a form of racism. But if it benefits them, if it disadvantages them, doesn't matter. That's not equality, that's equity. And I know it's going to shock you, but if you think about what was Hitler doing, he was saying who deserves what based on their racial identity. And we're going to racialize everybody, and then we're going to make that determination. We'll treat different religious groups as racial groups, and we'll give them privileges, advantages. What's a privilege? It's a special right. And we'll organize society along those lines. There'll be a hierarchy. There'll be intersections. All these things will be intersecting, and we'll have a hierarchy, and it will be the hierarchy of dominance, hierarchy of oppression. Sound familiar? This is exactly what the course we've been on. Douglas Murray puts it really well when he says, equality and freedom was like a train that was on its way to a destination. And we were pulling into the station, having dismantled Jim Crow segregation, having dismantled the patriarchy, having dismantled all of these structures, even eliminating heterosexist rules. Homosexuals were had gained their rights, could even marry. I mean, the train's coming into the station, and then all of a sudden it goes horribly off the rails. It just derails, just plows, past the station and through the woods. And it's not a perfect metaphor that the struggle, this is where that we should just go take the metaphor more abstractly, that the struggle for equality, freedom, democracy, individualism has gone horribly off the rails. It's been derailed. And we're finding ourselves in a place where we're thinking in a very illiberal, very authoritarian manner, very hierarchically, and thinking of individuals as personifications of abstract categories rather than as concrete individuals. That as a white person, that I project that I project some whiteness when I'm an individual, and being white tells you nothing about what I believe, what I eat, or anything. So we got to get back to that. And now that takes me to what I told you I wanted to talk about. This second big thing. And I started talking about teaching, I mentioned it when I said about teaching critical race theory and other theories in college. And so I want to make it very clear that legislation which would forbid teachers in college from teaching critical race theory, I oppose. Just like I oppose any legislation or any policy that would prevent a teacher from teaching theories critical of gender ideology, or policies that forbade a teacher from teaching racial science, that there are biological races and so forth and so on. I mean, because this is taught in physical anthropology, you can see students saying, wait a second, this sounds like racism. We've been told that this is racism. So they go to the administrators and they say, you got to stop this teacher from teaching this racism in class, or teaching that there's different races biologically. Maybe you wouldn't hear this today, because I think increasingly the progressives, of course, probably agree that there's these racial, they're even essentializing hairstyles and dress and everything. It's wild. It's totally nuts. It's totally authoritarian, but it's there. And I'm very critical of physical anthropology when it comes to the question of race. And I'm on record. I've blogged about it. I've been very clear about it. But I also am a staunch defender of academic freedom. And so I would never advocate laws forbidding that. I would never advocate policies forbidding that. I wouldn't want administrators to have control over curriculum. Look at cases like, Amy Wax makes claims about races, and they took her out of teaching this introductory class because they were worried that the students would be triggered by the things that she says. Or even she doesn't talk about that in class. They would read something she said outside of class, say in an interview with Glenn Lowry, and they'd be in class and they would know about that and find that triggering. In fact, that information would probably be fed to them and given to them. Do you know that your teacher said this? Because there's people who want to get Amy Wax fired. She's a law professor, big name university. Right? So I don't want to see any of that. And so, I teach critical race theory. It's not the only thing I teach, obviously. When I teach this law and society, I teach lots of different theories. Lots of theories. Dozens. And I come to critical race theory and critical legal studies and critical feminist studies and so forth and so on, because those are big areas in the law. They're taught at law schools, and if I'm teaching law and society, and a lot of my students go into law school, then they need to know about that. Doesn't mean I agree with those theories. Doesn't mean I'm not critical of them. I'm critical of all the theories I talk about in class. And I'll be honest with you, critical race theory is the worst social science legal theory in existence. It's just, and I've written about this on my blog, but it's just chock full of logical fallacies. When I talked about treating concrete individuals as personifications of abstract categories, the critical race theory does that. That's their mode of operation. Oh, horrible. And so I'm not going to rehearse all my arguments against critical race theory here. But professors should be free to teach what they want to teach in class if it's relevant to the subject area. Now, I would sharply criticize a teacher that taught everything from the perspective of critical race theory, or everything from the perspective of gender ideology, and because that's ideological. But it's hard to imagine what degree of that could trigger taking control of the classroom, or taking that professor out of the classroom, or preventing them from being promoted to being given tenure for that and so forth. No, don't like that. Now, before I talk about K through 12, let me just say the training piece of this, these training, seminars and workshops where you do diversity and inclusion and equity training and all of that, because that covers K through 12 through the university system. Those should be just canceled. They should stop. Those should be. I have no problem with legislation stopping that, and I'll tell you why. It's very obvious to me. Because critical race theory. Let's say you go in, you're going to learn about race, and we could talk about the ones in which feminist ideology informs them. But let's stick with race. That the critical race theory is a framework in which you go through a training session, and in order to accomplish that training session, to be considered having been trained in that area, you have to subscribe. You have to at least answer questions consistent with the ideology. That's indoctrination. It's not actually training. It's ideological indoctrination. They want you to accept a particular ideological view of the world. And let me give you a couple of analogies. To help you understand this very clearly. Imagine at a university or at K through 12, you couldn't be sure that every teacher believed in Darwinian evolution, theory of natural selection. And so you're saying, we need to make sure that anybody who teaches at this institution believes in Darwinian theory. And that's a good theory, unlike critical race theory, which is just garbage. Darwinian theory of natural selection is quite excellent. It's the foundation of modern medicine. And so in practice, we could make some criticisms of that for sure. It's the basis of modern biological sciences, natural history. So we would want teachers to believe in Darwinian evolution, but there's a lot of teachers who are creationists, who are still excellent at math. In fact, there are mathematicians who are creationists who are better at mathematics than mathematicians who subscribe to the theory of natural selection. There are English teachers. There are biology teachers that can do a fantastic job teaching biology and be Christians, be conservatives. Not all Christians believe in creationism, but let's say creationist. it would be a violation of their religious liberty. But more than that, because remember, the First Amendment isn't a different sentence, it's one long sentence. It would be a violation of their freedom of speech to force them into a training session in which the theory of natural selection was assumed as true and the only way of looking at the world, and that these Christians, these creationists, had to agree with that. But it is an atheistic worldview. It's a materialist worldview. I agree with it. I'm an atheist. I'm a materialist. But not everybody is. And so you would be forcing them. That's indoctrination, whether I think it's true or not. A conservative Christian believes that their faith is true. Creationists believe that's true. And so this would be indoctrination. This violates free speech, because free speech is not just about the freedom to speak and the freedom to receive speech. It's also about freedom from compelled speech. It's also freedom of association. That is assumed in the First Amendment. Otherwise, peaceful assembly to petition government for a redress of grievances, which is a collective endeavor, presumes freedom of association. You can't have an assembly without a free association. You can group people together, but we really call that an assembly. So these truckers in Canada, that's an assembly. It's an association. It doesn't mean that everybody in that association is responsible for everything that an individual member of that association does. Right? What it means is that they're, to some extent, there because of a convergence of interest along a particular issue. So you can't put a Christian through a training program and that requires them to accept what they see as an atheistic doctrine. Now they should learn about natural selection. If they're going to teach natural history and biology, they better know about it. Just like you could be an atheist and teach religious studies. If you're going to teach religious studies, you better know what you're talking about. That's a separate question. Question is, are you indoctrinating your students? And that gets to the K through 12 thing. And that's we'll get to that in a second. But is the administration of the university indoctrinating, and those faculty members that think their colleagues should think like they think, are they indoctrinating every employee? They make it a condition for promotion, for getting raises, for getting tenure, for getting a job. Is there a litmus test? And are people being required to believe things? This is a fundamental violation of human rights and civil liberties, and civil rights. These things are dreadful. They should not be allowed. Anywhere. In corporations, you say, well, corporations are private. They can do what they want. I disagree that corporations, particularly given that corporations are the dominant institution and the dominant governing institution in our society at this point, we have a corporate state. I think corporations must abide by the Bill of Rights. There's all sorts of other things too. I mean, the Fourth Amendment, which guarantees privacy, you say, well, that has to do with interactions with law enforcement. Yeah, but there's a principle that underpins that. It should apply everywhere. I believe it does. The right to remain silent, the Fifth Amendment. Silence isn't violence. Silence, a person has a right to be silent. If they don't want to speak, they don't have to. Are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Not going to answer that question. Well, you must be a communist then. No. I just don't believe you have a right to ask me that question. And I'm not going to answer the question. Now, if I'm going to be punished for not answering the question, then now what you've done is you're encouraging me to lie. And I think we've worked ourselves into a place because of the attack on speech and freedom, the attack on freedom of conscience. That's fundamental. It's really what we're talking about here. That's what ties religious liberty, free exercise, Congress shall make no law respecting, plus free speech, assembly, all that's freedom of conscience. That's so under assault that many people have to operate in bad faith just to prevent being punished for something that they shouldn't be punished for. So that needs to stop. Now, let me say to K through 12. Oh, no, before I do that, just one other example, since I brought up because I had two in my head, and as I was talking about them, I realized how related they are. I mean, I knew they were related, but fundamentally, because on the flip side of forcing a Christian to accept an atheist doctrine, or a materialist doctrine, let's say that, because atheism is sort of absence of belief in God, but materialism, certainly a positive belief. Can you imagine forcing a materialist or an atheist, let's say that the United States became a Christian society, as Christopher Hitchens brilliantly said, be careful, because things can flip, and you might have made a whip for your own back. Imagine conservative Christians in charge, and then the atheists and the materialists have to undergo training sessions, in which they are expected then to repeat theistic doctrines, that they are to accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior, etc., or whatever religion happens to take over. Just imagine that. It's scary on both sides. And as I started off saying, I said earlier, it would be accusing the left of hypocrisy. If only they were abiding by principles, then we could get them in a contradiction. But it's far more ugly than that. Because if you accuse somebody of hypocrisy, you can probably talk them out of. So why don't you get back to principle? But there's no principle here. There's just ideology. There's this drive, authoritarian drive to dominate culture, and they do. I think one of the hardest things for a lot of progressive Democrats to understand is they live in a world in which their views are daily projected in the establishment media. When you look at censorship and social media, for example, conservatives and right-wingers are routinely censored. Very rarely is somebody on the left censored. They hear their views in schools, K through 12 and through college. All their colleagues, most of their colleagues at least, are progressive Democrats. They see their views in the culture industry and Hollywood and everywhere. I mean, the culture is dominated by progressive ideology. And it's so dominated, progressives live so in their bubble that they just can't understand people in the heartland. Just can't get it. And so when they look at them, they must be backwards and deplorables and racist and all this, because they just can't understand why anybody wouldn't see the world from their urban, cosmopolitan, progressive worldview. Okay. And that actually takes us to K through 12, because critical race theory is taught there, and gender ideology is taught there, and it's taught there, and it is indoctrination. Most teachers and the teachers' unions and administrators are progressive Democrats, and they have an opportunity. They see this, that I have these children, and they're going to be with us, the faculty. They're going to be with us for 8 hours a day. And if they have homework and whatever, we're even going to reach into home life. So we've separated them from their parents, and we have them here. And while we have them, we're going to create a whole generation of people who think like we do. And I'm not going to tolerate people denying that this is what they think. I'm a teacher. My wife has been in the school district for years. I have, because of that and because of my experiences, I know lots of teachers in the district. I study pedagogy and education. I am a sociologist who understands how institutions work. I've studied administration, all of these things. And so I'm just not going to put up with the claim that this is not what the goal of teachers in today's K through 12 system. And they want to wrap social studies in critical race theory. And what they should be doing is they should be focusing on teaching mathematics, English, reading, writing, critical thinking, science. They should be focusing on that. And then when the kids get to college, then they can enter into classrooms where they'll debate these ideas. But they need to learn the skills first, not be indoctrinated. Teachers said, well, not everybody gets to go to college with these ideas. Right. And so that just reinforces the point that I just made, that you want to get them while you can, that you have them and you want to change them. And so do I think that we should have legislation? And I'm a small d Democrat, local control, small r Republican thinker. I'm a liberal. I believe in individualism. I believe in local control. I believe that a community, a real community, not these abstract communities, but real communities and families, they absolutely have the right to tell schools, no, you have this. The correct agenda is that you teach science, you teach math, you teach and of course, if they come in and say we want religious teachings as well, no, you can't do that. That's the First Amendment. We're covered on that, okay? And the First Amendment applies to everybody because everybody's first and foremost a citizen of the United States. So that all applies. So we won't worry there. We've got the Constitution. If we keep it, if we insist on these rights. If we keep it, then we have that at our backs. They absolutely have the right to say, we don't want our children taught. We don't want white children taught that they are members of an oppressor class and that they are privileged, advantaged on the basis of their skin color. It's not true. There's no evidence for it. Very careful to teach what we know, K through 12. But more importantly, we must not make students feel shame, and we must not create racial antagonisms in the classroom. We mustn't paint Black people as a victim group, teach them to be an aggrieved group, pit students against each other on the basis of race, because that takes me right back to what I was talking about at the beginning of this podcast. Takes us right back to the problems that we saw in Nazi Germany. And you may say, oh, well, that's an exaggeration. Yeah, well, where do these things start? Where do they start? They start when you start racializing populations and you start creating grievances. You start creating antagonisms. You start pitting people against each other on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, whatever. But it's all being subsumed under this notion of racialization, as it was then. And do I think it's going to get as bad as that? It doesn't have to. It doesn't have to. Because the end point of all of this is to extend and entrench the corporate state, the technocracy, the administrative state. Because Nazism fundamentally was about totalitarian monopoly capitalism. It was about the extension and entrenchment of the corporate state, about technocratic rule, about the destruction of democracy. That's what it was fundamentally about. And racialization was part of a set of tactics used to achieve those ends. And it doesn't have to look exactly like that. Do we have a dictator? Don't need one, as Sheldon Wolin pointed out. The inverted totalitarianism, the new totalitarianism, the new fascism, as I call it, is fascism in substance. It fits the definition, as Franz Neumann writes about in Behemoth, totalitarian monopoly capitalism. And this breaking out of its nationalist shell. Hey, look, Hitler had global ambitions too. Well, so does the transnational corporation. And so the racialization we're seeing today is for those ends. If it can achieve those ends peacefully, it will. Whoopi stepped in it. I don't like Whoopi Goldberg very much. I used to like her comedy years ago. Something's happened to her. I'm ideologically, not mentally, I won't go there. Ideologically, something's happening to a lot of people. But the whole episode, it troubles me deeply because what I see as a person on the left, I see all the people who were on the left with me having gone somewhere else. And Bill Maher recently, was it last night or the other night? I don't know. I saw a clip. I don't watch the Bill Maher show. I don't have cable. But he said this. He said, hey, the left left me. And he's right. He's right. And the reason why used to be that the right wing hated Bill Maher, but increasingly they like him. Why? Because here's a man has principle. And he saw these changing views, and he's not going to be a hypocrite based on principle. So he says, all right, I can't accept that. That's not a genuine left-wing view. I'm going to stay true to who I am. And because the right wing is becoming more and more populist, being true to who you are is a value that they appreciate, as opposed to the establishment conservatives, the Republicans, what a lot of the populists call rhinos, right? Republicans in name only. I'm not going to get into a whole thing about what does it mean to be a genuine Republican with a big R. I do know what it means to be a genuine Republican with a small R. And what we're seeing now is that this left versus right is less relevant than is progressivism versus populism. And I think if you believe in democracy, small d, believe in republicanism, small r, if you believe in liberalism, small l, if you believe in individualism, big I, then you need to take a look at populist politics. Have a great day. Bye.